Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I feel like I'm talking in a corner. If we can, just shift over to the middle, please. It's not an issue for the screen, but it would help with projection and angling, right? So if you'd be so kind. Wonderful. There we are. Wonderful. And chances are we'll be much cozier sitting together. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Faculty of Humanities and Education and to our 9th Faculty Distinguished Lecture. It is really a pleasure to see all of you gathered here today, both here in our lecture theatre and online, as we celebrate the intellectual prowess and scholarly achievements within our community. I am Dr. Stanley H. Griffin, your Deputy Dean for Undergraduate Matters, and it is my privilege to chair our time together today. I'm pleased to welcome all of you, both here in the theatre and joining us online for this lecture. Let me take the privilege of recognizing some leaders who are with us this afternoon. First, our Dean of the Faculty, Professor Sylvia Cowenberg, the Pro-Vice Chancellor for the Board of Undergraduate Studies, Professor Derek Chady, and our campus librarian, Dr. Paulette Carr, our various deputy deans, our heads of departments, and especially Dr. Rosemary Heath, who is the department that has sponsored, perhaps, that has, spearheaded, yes, that's the word, our time together this evening. The various directors of schools, institutes, and colleges, and our professors and lecturers, as well as our students. I believe most will be online, while our faculty reps are at the Guild handing over, so they're otherwise occupied. But all of us, it's good to see all of you who are here this evening. I'm also very pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Eaton, our featured distinguished lecturer, who will be formally introduced later in the program. So, yes, my script. The lecture series stands as a testament to our commitment to academic excellence and the pursuit of knowledge. Each year, we invite renowned scholars from various disciplines to share their expertise and insights with us, enriching our academic discourse and inspiring us to push our boundaries of our own understanding. So we've had from history and journalism to language and linguistics, and so tonight's lecture comes to us from the disciplines in the Department of Library and Information Studies, and we will focus on academic integrity. As we embark on this intellectual journey tonight, let us open our minds to new ideas, challenge our assumptions, and engage in meaningful dialogue. May this lecture serve as a reminder of the profound impact that scholarship and research can have on our lives and the world we live in. So once again, please feel welcome, and we look forward to your full participation. I now invite the Dean to bring greetings, Professor Sylvia Cowenberg, the Dean.
Thank you, Dr. Griffin. I'm just going to say friends and colleagues. I'm glad to see you here. I know a number of friends and colleagues have joined us online, so to them too, I want to say welcome. I thought I would just do a little overview of the lectures that we have had to date. The first annual lecture, the first of the faculty's annual lecture, and let me say that this is a concept that was Dean Wibinte Wariboko's initiative. The first lecture was delivered by Deborah Hickling under the title, If Ideas Matter, How Not Nagwan for Creatives. And this immediately set a tone, because what the tradition has been is to focus in a particular area where we have something of significance to say. So this coincided with the development of the program in cultural and creative industries. And therefore, the focus of the lecture was on that particular area and its significance for Caribbean development and our role in it. The second annual distinguished lecture, delivered in 2017 by Professor Hopton Dunn, focused on technology, digital literacies, and our robotic futures. And here we see an area of development in the faculty that focused on digital technologies. And Professor Dunn, of course, was the director of the Caribbean Institute of Media and Communication, CARIMAC, which was developing programs, or had developed programs in digital media production, animation, and film production. The third lecture, delivered by Alex Gill, on towards a Caribbean digital humanities praxis. It was an area that caused a lot of excitement at the time, which kind of petered out a bit, but we are reviving it. It is, of course, the case that in all of our programs we engage with digital practices. What we really want to re-engage with is a process of focusing that engagement. The fourth lecture was delivered by Dr. Aldrin Sweeney, who was then in the School of Education, and it focused on STEM education. And he was really showing us how STEM education can take what we do to the next level. The fifth annual distinguished lecture was delivered by Dr. Maurice Walsh on the journalism in relationship to history, and sort of arguing that journalists are the first stage in history. Journalism is the first stage in history writing. And this focused at the time around the developing program in the developing double major in history and journalism. And let me just remind us that this took place during the pandemic, April 2020. Okay. One of the significant things that we did was to not allow the pandemic to halt our, significant activities. And the same was true for the next year's annual distinguished lecture delivered by Kenneth Bilby on Jamaican music at home and abroad, keeping the circuits grounded. I don't know how many of you remember, but this was a really exciting lecture with a lot of musical illustration. And this was around the development of the program in music and performance studies. Then in 2022, it's just 2 years ago, the lecture on teaching from the digital Black Atlantic by Professor Rupika Rissam. Teaching from the digital Black Atlantic, again, focused attention on digital developments in our fields and how it is that in humanities and education we can take leadership in conversations around digital literacy and the use of digital tools. Last year's distinguished lecture by Professor Shalom Gooden, Beyond Scholarship in Humanities and Social Sciences, Lessons from Linguistics, again focused on how we can take leadership in research and make our mark. And so this year, we are pleased to have with us Sarah Eaton to deliver this lecture on academic integrity and ethical decision-making. And I just want to quote something from this little booklet. Anyone who does not actually have it can pick up. We still have a few copies in faculty office. This was the first set of distinguished lectures bundled by Joe Pereira, under the editorship of Joe Pereira. And in his introduction, and let me apologize to my colleagues in education because he was really focusing on humanities. He pointed out that unlike some disciplines, it is difficult to quantify the intrinsic value of the humanities. In the Caribbean, the greatest value of the humanities may be its role in examining, revealing, and contributing to cultural identity. It interrogates historical record and cultural expressions for a deeper and more accurate understanding of the dynamics of our society. It helps preserve our heritage and challenges assumptions and established positions. In doing so, it forces us to analyze and critique and thereby sharpen our critical thinking. He went on to say that the humanities also encourage creativity by exploring imaginative possibilities, facilitating innovation even in areas beyond the humanities, including science, medicine, and technology. Perhaps literary studies lend themselves particularly to this imaginative exploration. It helps to hone problem-solving skills, and it is through the humanities too that we get a deeper appreciation of aesthetics and artistic production, even a deeper understanding of ourselves and our spiritual being. The humanities can help us to be more human and humane as we develop an appreciation of others and our society. This in turn can enhance social cohesion and ethical decision-making. Don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to close with one short citation, perhaps more than ever. Wholesome values, attitudes, and strong ethical foundations are needed, and these can be enhanced through the humanities. His reference to strong ethical foundations is especially relevant to today's lecture. And with that, I say welcome to the Faculty of Humanities in Education, and please enjoy our distinguished lecture.
Thank you, Dean. Let me quickly recognize the presence of our acting deputy principal, Professor Marvin Reed. Good to see you, sir. And now I invite the head of the Department of Library and Information Studies, Dr. Rosemary Heath, to introduce our featured distinguished lecturer. Following the introduction, you will hear Dr. Sarah Eaton, who will work her magic, and then Dr. Ruth Baker-Gardner, lecturer in the department, who will moderate the question and answer period. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Sarah Eaton, who is an associate professor at the Werklund School of Education at the University of Calgary, Canada. She's an educator, researcher, and leader. She leads transdisciplinary research teams focused on the ethical implications of advanced technology use in educational contexts. Dr. Eaton also holds a concurrent appointment as an honorary associate professor at Deakin University in Australia. She has received research awards of excellence for her scholarship on academic integrity from the Canadian Society for the Study of Higher Education in 2020 and the European Network of Academic Integrity in 2022. Dr. Eaton has written and presented extensively on academic integrity and ethics in higher education, and is regularly invited as a media guest to talk about academic misconduct. She's the editor-in-chief of the International Journal for Educational Integrity. Her books include Plagiarism in Higher Education, Tackling Tough Topics in Academic Integrity, Academic Integrity in Canada, An Enduring and Essential Challenge, Contract Cheating in Higher Education, Global Perspectives on Theory, Practice, and Policy, Ethics and Integrity in Teacher Education, and Fake Degrees and Fraudulent Credentials in Higher Education. She's also the editor-in-chief of the Handbook of Academic Integrity, which had its second edition published in 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Sarah Eaton.
Esteemed colleagues, engaged students, and everyone Thank you for joining us here this evening. I appreciate the invitation. I'll begin with a little bit of housekeeping. You have my permission to take photos of any of the slides that you wish, or if you're joining us online, any of the screenshots you wish. You can share the slides on social media or elsewhere with attribution, and you can feel free to contact me with questions afterwards. I would also like to start by expressing my gratitude to Dr. Cohenberg, Dr. Heath, and Dr. Ruth Baker Gardner, along with all of the team who made tonight possible. It's really an honor and a privilege for me to be here and join you tonight. Because I work in ethics and plagiarism, I must start by situating this work in its provenance. Tonight's work is drawn from 3 published works, Plagiarism in Higher Education, Academic Integrity in Canada, and the Second Handbook of Academic Integrity, as well as a federally funded research project on academic integrity and artificial intelligence, looking at the ethics of teaching and learning with algorithmic writing technologies. I'll start by situating academic integrity and talk a little bit about what it is. Often framed as a set of values, these values were articulated by the International Center for Academic Integrity: courage, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility, and trust. These values are not necessarily absolute, but instead provide a positive foundation to talk to students about ethical decision-making in the classroom. This framework was first introduced in 1999 and continues to be an important framework for students all over the world, in the United States and beyond. However, situating academic integrity within a set of morals and values, thank you. Thanks. Within a set of morals and values is one way of framing this work, but it's not the only way. In one of the chapters in the Second Handbook of Academic Integrity, I worked with an American colleague by the name of Dr. Teresa Teddy Fishman, and we began by exploring differences in academic integrity between Canada and the United States. We know that from my Canadian context, we're often compared with the United States in many ways, but we know that as a Commonwealth country, our education system has more in common with British traditions than it does with US traditions. Our conversation led to an exploration of some of the differences within the United States itself, and we were able to identify 2 different and distinct schools of thought, one around values and morality that I just shared with you, and this one is heralded largely by scholars from the International Center for Academic Integrity, Tricia Bertram-Gallant, the founder of the ICAI, Don McCabe, and then David Rettinger. But there's a different, distinct, and somewhat polarized school of thought that says academic integrity has nothing to do with values and morality. It has to do with academic literacy and skills, and we should separate skills and behavior from morality and character. This school of thought is espoused by scholars who are largely compositionists and humanists, such as Rebecca Moore-Howard, Sandra Jameson, Lisa Panning-Davies, and Amy Robillard. In our conversations around this, we identified that the scholars from the 2 schools of thought don't work together, even though Rebecca Moore-Howard worked at Syracuse University in New York, just across the state line from Don McCabe, who is at Rutgers in New Jersey. They worked at the same time, never referencing one another's work. I know it's hard to believe there might be polarized opinions in the United States. That led us in Canada to start thinking about what might our contributions be to this conversation, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. One of the things I'd like to emphasize tonight is that there are no universal definitions of academic integrity, and as you continue to develop this work here, I would encourage you to think about what makes sense for you in your context here. And I will give a shout out here to Dr. Ruth Baker Gardner, because she's esteemed and renowned internationally for her work on academic integrity in the Caribbean and continues to be one of my inspirations in this field. So thank you, Dr. Baker Gardner. I'll begin by situating this work in what academic integrity is and isn't. And I can tell you, colleagues, that one of my pet peeves as a scholar and practitioner is when I hear people tell me that we're dealing with a case of academic integrity. We don't deal with integrity, we celebrate it, and we want our students to live with integrity. We deal with breaches of integrity, or violations of integrity, or misconduct. This continuum was one I developed with graduate students who were also struggling with the nomenclature around this work. So we looked at one end around academic integrity as building education, skills, and communication of expectations with students. This is the work that we can do in the classroom with our students and talk to them in positive ways, framing this around ethical decision-making. But as educators, there's that moment when you know something's gone wrong, or you suspect something's gone wrong, or you've seen the crib notes during the exam and you're sure something's gone wrong. At that moment, particularly for new and early career researchers, there can be a moment of panic and I don't know what to do. Who do I talk to? Where do I go for help? What are the policies? What are the impacts on the student if I report them? All of this can be involved as part of the emotional labor of reporting academic misconduct. This is the moment of what we call a critical incident, sometimes associated with the gray area, and where there's then identification of if there's been an actual breach of integrity and what might be the steps taken to conduct an investigation. Then we move to the other side of the continuum where we're talking about breaches or misconduct. Here we're talking about those who have the soul-crushing job of conducting investigations and managing cases of misconduct, conducting hearings, applying sanctions, and administering appeals. So this continuum is something that we can move along in our careers. The classroom educator who promotes integrity in one year can be the administrator who's investigating the next year. So it's important to get the wording right. So let's think for a moment about who cheats. What does academic cheating look like? We talked a little bit about this in the workshop yesterday, and today I'd like to expand on this by drawing on the work of Deborah Rohde from the United States. She has an excellent book that's simply called Cheating, and she talks about cheating in various contexts: financial embezzlement, cheating in romantic relationships, academic cheating, and she talks about this bell curve of normal. So I've adapted that and sort of built a graphic around it. And when you do this work for a long time, you get this sense that there are a few number of students who don't cheat, and we wish everyone was like them, and that all the rest of the world is out there doing bad things. But this is a bell curve of normal. So this is actually a skewed perception. Rohde would argue that the majority of people would fall within the normal category. And at one end of the bell curve, we have the outliers, those wonderful people who never cheat no matter what happens. And at the other end of the bell curve, we might have people that we would call serial cheaters or repeat offenders. And I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but we might be able to identify some kind of pathology there. But it's a small percentage of students who consistently cheat without remorse. And in the middle, there's the normal people. The normal people, and I would be one of them, because I don't come to this work wearing a halo. I remember copying from the Encyclopedia Britannica when I was 8 years old, and that tells you how old I am, more or less. But I've never forgotten it. And I genuinely remember thinking that I couldn't say it any better, and I never got caught by the teacher, and I've also never forgotten. So I'm pleased to tell you today that I'm normal, more or less. But my point here is that if you put most people in a situation where they have an opportunity to make a bad decision, they might do it. So the idea of thinking about our students as normal people on the bell curve with just a small percentage who might actually be the so-called bad apples. And here I'd like to draw on the work of my friend and colleague, Dr. Philip Newton at Swansea University, and he puts it very simply like this. He says, people cheat, and students are people. So now I'll kind of frame this to the second handbook of academic integrity, and this book, as I mentioned, has just come out. It is considered the authoritative source in our field. It's comprised of 2 volumes, almost 2,000 pages, 112 chapters, contributed by 145 authors, one of whom is Dr. Baker Gardner. And one of my tasks as the editor-in-chief was to read the entire handbook during its development. I had a sabbatical to do it, don't worry. But then to draw through lines through the whole book and what were the common themes. And at first this was a struggle for me because I thought that there was sort of a bunch of disparate chapters between 2 covers, or 4 covers because there's 2 volumes. But as I thought about it more and sat with it, I realized that there were a number of different interconnected themes, and this framework emerged. And I need to give credit to my colleague at the University of British Columbia in Canada. I mentioned he calls this the colorful swirly donut of integrity. So let me walk you through it. The orange swirl around student academic conduct is how plagiarism, cheating, and so on has historically been framed. We've seen this as a matter of student conduct alone. But we know that many of our students are leading increasingly more complicated lives, and our graduate students, particularly those who do PhDs by publication, find themselves writing articles, working in laboratories, and really are working as junior researchers or academics in training. For this reason, it's important for students to know things about publication ethics, how to negotiate authorship on a scientific paper, what happens when there's a violation of publication ethics, who do they go to? It's not a student problem by that point. What happens when there's a breach of research integrity in the laboratories they're working with the principal investigator? How does that get reported? Who's held responsible? What does it look like? And more of our students need to apply for research ethics approval before conducting their own research. So those traditional notions of plagiarism are also adding things to them that students in previous generations may not have had. This takes us around to the idea of instructional ethics. This is the ethical way or the unethical way that educators might assess students, and the responsibilities of educators to ensure that their assessments are ethical for their students, that the expectations are articulated in a clear way for their students. This is closely connected to ethical leadership and institutional ethics, with the through line there being we cannot expect our students to act with integrity if the institutions in which they're learning are corrupt. Now, I would never suggest that your institution is corrupt or my institution is corrupt because I know we would like to keep our jobs. However, you might imagine with 112 chapters from all over the world, we heard about cases of things such as sex for grades schemes or other kinds of corruption, bribery, or, as I've heard about recently, teachers and administrators releasing exams to students for a fee before the students get to write those examinations. If we as educators and administrators do not act with integrity, how can we expect our students to follow in our footsteps? And it is up to us to set the stage for that. Because academic integrity is ultimately a foundation for ethical decision-making in everyday life, which is the blue swirl at the top. And finally, coming full circle, thinking about our students as future professionals and professional and collegial ethics as being the end goal of academic integrity, and also the way that we conduct ourselves so our students can follow in our footsteps in a good way. So this brings us full circle. The key message around this is that academic integrity includes and extends beyond student conduct. And we need to challenge historical notions that this is just about students paying attention to the rules, because in reality, it's much more than that. So I'll turn my attention now to the book on plagiarism in higher education. And I will say, please don't buy this book, it's very boring. I will give you the highlights tonight precisely so you don't have to buy the book. The book starts with a historical analysis of plagiarism in the Western European context, and then looks at plagiarism today, including things like contract cheating, term paper mills, thesis completion services, and so on. And in the final chapter, turn my attention towards the future of plagiarism. In the Western European world, one of the earliest cases that we have of plagiarism is with Pythagoras. So I know that our STEM colleagues aren't here tonight, so you can go and tell them a story about plagiarism after tonight that's now been shown verified through a number of sources, that plagiarism was conducted by Pythagoras, who was invited to Egypt to study there and appropriated ideas from the Egyptians that he then took back with him to Greece and became known as the Pythagorean theorem. Apparently, when the Egyptians found out that their theory had been called the Pythagorean theorem, they weren't too happy. So plagiarism has been alive and well for a long time. And we can fast forward a number of centuries to the impact of the printing press around 1450, with notions of plagiarism being shaped by technology. This was the first time that we see a new technology taking hold and ideas of plagiarism being connected to it. But at this time, certainly in Europe, plagiarism did not result in the same reaction that we get today, but instead the reaction to it was ridicule. People were scorned and mocked for being too lazy to come up with their own ideas. And it wasn't until copyright laws came in, probably 100 years later, that things began to change and a legalistic approach to plagiarism was taken. But back in the 1400s, it was enough if you were scorned. Let's keep going again to the Industrial Revolution, which catalyzed, of course, the early massification of education and really laid the foundation for modern notions of student conduct that we have today. This was a time when, of course, behavior compliance, rule compliance, and obedience were an essential part of a child's education. And in terms of plagiarism, we saw that as literacy rates increased and more people learned to read and write, so too did plagiarism rates increase. This was the first time in history we really saw children being actively punished for acts of academic misconduct. And from my studies in this area, I would say that we continue to perpetuate our responses to student conduct that are rooted in the Industrial Revolution. We have not yet moved beyond this at a global level. So it's something to think about when we're applying policies and procedures to students of the ways in which we continue to perpetuate these historical norms for our students. So we'll fast forward again. So you're really getting the quick version tonight. The impact of the internet, of course, made everything faster and more efficient, writing, research, mobilization of knowledge, and also, of course, it made plagiarism faster and more efficient. This was the first time in history that we had the cut and paste phenomenon. This didn't exist. Remember, I hand copied from the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, nobody does that, I don't think, anyway. Maybe they do. But cut and paste became the thing, the norm. But what this really led to was a reaction towards new technologies and plagiarism that was previously something we didn't pay attention to, leading to what I've called the academic integrity arms race. So it kind of goes like this. And if you remember the introduction of the internet like me, you may remember this happening. The blue arrow at the top, the new technology comes in, resulting in a variety of reactions: excitement, confusion, eagerness, resistance, worry, other reactions. Then, very quickly, educators are challenged to use this new technology in their teaching. What will we do? How will we do it? How will we do it ethically? What does this mean for learning? Will it make our children stupid? We don't know the answers to any of these things. But we know that we have to respond in some way. At the same time, students, I was a student at the time, begin experimenting with this new technology like the internet. How can we use it? How can we misbehave with it? In some ways, there are curiosities that drive the use of this technology, not necessarily setting out to cheat, but rather a genuine interest in exploring how the technology can work and how it can be used in a variety of ways. Then enter companies with what they call the solution to academic misconduct, remembering that academic misconduct has been with us since the ancient Greeks, but nevertheless there are companies who will come and effectively sell us technological snake oil, saying they have the solution to this through anti-cheating technology. More technology is developed to catch students using technology to violate academic integrity, often marketed as a solution to academic misconduct. And to this I say, students don't win in this equation. Educators don't win in this equation. The companies selling us their products win in this equation, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. But our students are smart, and they find workarounds to the anti-cheating technology. And I usually refrain from mentioning particular companies in talks like this, but you know the companies that I'm talking about, and you know the websites that students are going to, how to hack the anti-cheating technology, and they post videos online, and they post electronic messages online, and next thing you know, students have shown us how they're hacking the new technology. And now we have exactly the same thing happening with artificial intelligence and companies that telling us that they can detect text generated by artificial intelligence apps, and I'm here to tell you tonight the research shows that is wrong. There is no accurate way to detect text that's been done by artificial intelligence, and this has been shown through studies. Deborah Weber-Wolf led a team from the European Network on Academic Integrity. Mike Perkins and Jasper Rowe followed up with a subsequent study. So the message is clear. If you are going to spend money on things like anti-cheating technology, please instead put that money towards teaching and learning and hiring human beings to work with students. Technology can't solve this human problem. That's why we're looking at a wraparound approach to student success that challenges these historical approaches that are antagonistic and adversarial, that put students against their professors and students against their administrator. Who are the bad guys? Who are the good guys? But rather, we're all in this together. And in a wraparound approach to student success, or a multi-stakeholder approach, administrators take responsibility for having policies that are up to date. that are clear, that can be found easily online. Faculty commit to talking about academic integrity in class. The staff who are involved in things like setting up meetings, maintaining records and notes, understand the regulations for privacy around that, and for us, community stakeholders are a part of it as well. This can be alumni of the university, in our case, also funders of the university, and parents of the university. So this is a community problem. It does not absolve students of their responsibility to act ethically, but also recognizing that other stakeholders have responsibility in this equation. So this has basically been plagiarism in the past and in the current state. But the final chapter of the book, so Professor Kauenberg was talking about COVID-19. This book was due to the publisher in May of 2020. So you can imagine what I was doing, right? Like all of you, I was sequestered in my house. I wasn't allowed to go anywhere. I was just writing, and this book had to be sent in to the publisher. In the last 2 weeks before the manuscript was due, I was madly rewriting the last chapter, because in May of 2020, we had indications that artificial intelligence would have an impact on writing. We just didn't know what it was. It was 2.5 years before ChatGPT. But at the beginning of the talk, I talked about that group of scholars that didn't look at academic integrity through a moral lens, but rather through a skills-based lens. Rebecca Moore-Howard is one of those people. And she writes that we should throw the word definition of plagiarism out of our policies and instead focusing on teaching students. She has a great article called "Don't Police, Just Teach." And I thought, okay, Professor Howard, what happens if we throw out the definition of plagiarism from our policies? And I couldn't answer the question. I couldn't imagine a policy without a definition of plagiarism. So instead, I kind of reframed the question, thought, what if we transcend it? What does that look like? And an idea around a post-plagiarism world came to mind. There's a lot of text on this screen. I'll walk you through it. Don't worry, you don't have to be able to read it. But what would it look like if we didn't have plagiarism anymore? If artificial intelligence created a world in which historical notions of plagiarism didn't exist? So I'll share some of those ideas with you tonight. So post-plagiarism, I would call it an era in human society which advanced technologies are a normal part of life. It's part of how we teach, learn, interact daily, and post-plagiarism heralds a new era of intellectual engagement in the age of advanced technology. So let's unpack that really wordy infographic. Got this down to 6 tenets. The first of them is that human AI writing will become normal. So this infographic is based on the book written in 2020. The infographic was written in February of 2023, so it's a year old now. So thinking about ChatGPT as it had just come out then, we know now, if you've played with ChatGPT or other apps, that you can use that as kind of a draft tool. You can remix, reuse, but when this first came out a year ago, people were thinking of text generated by ChatGPT as something static. I was like, no, but what if the idea of a hybrid human partnership becomes the norm? And now we see that artificial intelligence is quickly becoming integrated into Microsoft through its Copilot applications, through the Google Workspace. It will soon be as ubiquitous in our everyday applications as spell check now. We would never tell students, or perhaps our colleagues, that they'd be acting unethically if they use spell check. We think, for heaven's sake, please use spell check. And that this soon will become the norm. But so the question then becomes trying to determine where the human ends and where the artificial intelligence begins becomes relatively pointless and futile, because that may not be the thing that we're trying to assess in the end. Having said that, there is no evidence that human creativity is in any way threatened by artificial intelligence. I draw here from Amy Orban's work. Amy Orban has a terrific article from 2020 in which she talks about the Sisyphean cycle of moral panic for new technology. She goes back 100 years and talks about a new technology that was going to result in moral corruption and the stupidity of young children, and that technology was the radio. She then goes on to talk about the television, which was my generation. And one of the first shows that I watched was my dad's favorite TV show, Star Trek. And so that the TV was supposed to make my generation stupid and illiterate. I hope that didn't happen. However, the idea that we have is that our ability to inspire one another and engage with each other creatively and intellectually will not be harmed by artificial intelligence. We will continue to be able to imagine and create and inspire. This becomes one of the things that makes us uniquely human. I recognize that this is a completely different argument, though, from the creatives who make their life and their living from their creative acts and the threat that might be posed from artificial intelligence. I recognize that there have been popular authors, a Canadian, Margaret Atwood among them, who've led campaigns, letter writing campaigns, that this technology should be regulated and so forth. The threat to those who may make their livelihood from creative acts is different and distinct from the threat to human creativity itself. So I just want to distinguish between those things. So I confess to you that one of the first TV shows I watched was actually my dad's favorite around Star Trek, and that's the idea of a human translator. The universal translator has been with me since before I could walk. The idea of language barriers being overcome by artificial intelligence. In February of 2023, this still seemed like something that was a little far off. But now we have technologies that can do deep fakes of videos. I could have recorded this video and had it redone in any language I wanted to, because the applications already exist that would produce that video in my voice in the other language. The technology's already here. So this was the point, though. When I posted this on social media, I share a lot of my stuff openly and free on the internet. This one got a little bit of backlash because I had said here that one's first language would begin to matter less and less as the tools became available for humans to understand each other in countless languages. And what I did not mean when I said that one's first language would begin to matter less was that one's first language would become unimportant. I understand the language politics and the importance of one's language. What I mean here is that the barriers that separate us will become less important. So that was an important clarification. This, I think, is particularly important in a year when we have major global elections. And the deep fake technology is being accelerated and perpetuated by companies that can sell the deep fake technology. So this is one to watch out for. It's for the second language teachers as well. If you ask your students to create a language video as an assignment, just be aware that they can use AI to help them. This takes us over from the creative and fun side of things over to the side that I like to call the dark side. Thinking about misconduct and artificial intelligence and what does it mean. One of the service roles that I hold is an elected member of the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. In 2022, we had our annual retreat in the UK, and there were publishers there from Springer, Wiley, Taylor and Francis, all the big scientific publishers, and we talked about this question of ChatGPT being an author. This was already starting to surface, or artificial intelligence being an author. What they settled on was the idea that ChatGPT shouldn't be listed as an author. Some articles had already appeared in print by then, and they were later issued with corrections. There may still be a few out there, but the big publishers all got together and decided no, that there should be another way to handle the use of artificial intelligence. If you ask me, the jury is still out on this. I've seen the APA guidance and the MLA guidance on this, and in terms of citing ChatGPT. And in some ways, I think it's an attempt to show transparency and process around it. But in terms of actual citation, if the purpose of citing and referencing is to follow the breadcrumbs and find the original source, that might not be so easy if we're citing the output of ChatGPT. But what we can take away from this is that we as humans can outsource our academic work, our scholarly work, so can our students. We can relinquish control to an artificial intelligence in whole or in part. I can ask ChatGPT to write me an entire essay if I want. I can ask it to draft it, and I then take over and finish the product. So this idea of relinquishing control is an important piece, but what we don't relinquish is our responsibility for the output. It is still humans that remain responsible for scientific, scholarly, academic output. And this is why, if students are turning in work that is done wholly by ChatGPT and they actually haven't done their homework and they have fabricated references, which we know ChatGPT can do very well, the students can be held responsible for the fabricated and falsified references. So this idea of relinquishing control but not responsibility becomes very important when we think about how we will deal with misconduct. Certainly, as a plagiarism scholar, attribution remains important. But what is important to me as a scholar is the ethos of attribution. I want my students to know on whose shoulders they are standing, in whose footsteps they are following. I want them to know who are the big names in their field. One of the activities I do with doctoral students now is I tell them, okay, I'm going to give you an article the first time. I said, read the article, make sure you come to class and know the article. And we're going to talk about it in class. And then they come to class. I say, okay, please turn the article over. And the first question I ask them is, who wrote it? And they're like, what? What question are you at? What? Like the content is one thing, but if you don't know the scholars you are reading, then you yourself are not yet a scholar. So we flip things around and take things from the content and start with a people-centered approach. And then we go from there. And I tell you, the doctoral students know the author of every single article they read after that. So it always has been and always will be appropriate and desirable to appreciate and admire those from whom we've learned. And citing and referencing and attribution remain important skills. And I'm just going to take a pause here and say, when, as a humanist that was in this field, I was a little distressed when I heard Noam Chomsky say that ChatGPT was nothing more than high-tech plagiarism and had nothing to do with education. People started sending me that YouTube video where he had that interview, and I thought, oh, okay, I need to go look at this YouTube interview. So I did. I tracked down the original source, and I refrained from commenting in part because he's such an esteemed scholar, but it just didn't sit right with me. And I kept thinking about it, and then later, a couple of months later, he and some colleagues published the same ideas in an editorial in the New York Times. And I thought, no, I have to say something. I disagree with Noam Chomsky on this point. I don't believe that ChatGPT is nothing more than high-tech plagiarism. And I think if you asked educators anywhere in the world, no one would say it has nothing to do with education, because right now it's in every classroom all over the world. But I think one of the things that Professor Chomsky is talking about here is thinking about plagiarism in our historical norms. What I'm advocating here is thinking about a post-plagiarism world in which our historical definitions no longer apply. And I will say, of course, that as scholars, we can disagree with one another's ideas and still hold each other in high esteem as human beings, which is the case. I still hold, of course, Professor Chomsky in high esteem as one of the great public intellectuals of our time. But ultimately, our historical definitions of plagiarisms, the ones that were really solidified at the time of the printing press 500 years ago, they just don't work anymore. But what we don't have yet is a new way of thinking about things. We don't yet have new definitions, and this is what is part of what makes this struggle so difficult at this point in history. But if we think about the idea, going back to the idea of human AI writing being normal rather than being a transgression, and thinking about that cycle of what is the next new technology. So in some of these talks I say, our historical definitions may require questioning and consideration. But for the education colleagues who are joining us tonight, think about this. Kindergarten teachers who are teaching children this year, the 5- and 6-year-olds this year, will graduate high school around 2041, 2042. What will their future look like? I can tell you this, it's sure as heck not ChatGPT. In 2023, UNESCO released a report that if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it, and it's around neurotechnology, brain implants as being the next ethical complexity that we will have to face. So they're talking here about Elon Musk's Neuralink products and embeddable technologies that used to be medicalized and specialized, but are quickly becoming socialized and commercialized. Soon these technologies will be available to the everyday person, providing they can pay for them. So paying attention to that UNESCO report is something worth looking at. So I'll turn my attention now to the current research that we have ongoing at the University of Calgary around understanding the impact of artificial intelligence on higher education. This was what we call a transdisciplinary research project. Transdisciplinary meaning it starts with a wicked problem that no one person can solve from their own discipline. So I brought together a team from across our campus. My colleague Bob Brennan from Mechanical Engineering, Jason Weens from the Department of English, and another colleague, Dr. Brenda McDermott. When we started that project, this came out right after the book. So the book was published in 2021. I was starting to think about this project, put together a team. First, we started with an internal teaching and learning grant. We put in our application in October of 21 to the internal teaching and learning grant. So the timeline's a bit important here. And they said, are you kidding us? Artificial intelligence in our classrooms? That's not going to happen. We're like, yeah, we think it is. They said, go and bolster your literature review. So we did. We got our little grant, and then we got a federal grant, and that was in 2022. So we were a little bit ahead of the game. But when we started with our research team in 2021, I can tell you this. The mechanical engineer thought AI was the best thing since sliced bread, bring it on. The creative writer thought this was heinous and need to be banned now. And then the third colleague, Dr. Brenda McDermott, was not an academic, but rather a member of our professional staff. And she said, she was the manager of our student accessibility services. So she works with students with all kinds of disabilities. And she said, if these technologies are assistive or adaptive technologies, are we violating students' human rights if we deny them access? Well, what that did was disrupt our polarized positions right away and showed us that we needed to be thinking about this from a variety of perspectives that were nuanced and complex. So from there, we adopted more of a complexity perspective. And our binary, and oppositional framings were quickly dismantled. And I think we've become more on the same page as the project has taken shape. We don't quite have all our data analyzed yet. But I can say, when you hear me and other people use the words like ChatGPT, we can say it's kind of like Kleenex or Xerox. We use this to talk about all artificial intelligence applications, but we know that AI is one product from one company at one point in time. And in fact, OpenAI, the company that created ChatGPT, has themselves new and more advanced products since then. But OpenAI is not alone. If you haven't heard of this directory, it's worth checking out. Futurepedia is a directory of more than 5,000 applications. This directory is updated daily with new artificial intelligence applications, including both text and non-text-based applications. By non-text-based applications, I'm talking about AI apps that can do things like create entire slide decks. I promise this one wasn't done by AI. But other apps that can create videos, deepfakes, any kind of digital project you can imagine, there's an app for that, quite literally. Some of them are free, and some of them cost a little bit of money. Some of them have a subscription fee. But these apps are becoming more and more prominent. Anybody can access this app, any member of the public. And I can say if your university is anything like ours, our operations people are turning to these apps as well. I can tell you this year at our university, our communications and marketing manager, he's just been promoted to vice president, created an app for writing all the university's news stories and trained that app based on all the previous news stories and PR from the university in the past. So the app can now write in the voice and the tone that before junior people would have done. And he said he doesn't want junior people to write those news stories anymore. He wants them to do the fact-checking and the editing of them. So we are starting to think as a university, how do we integrate this into our operations? And businesses are doing the same things. Governments are doing the same things. And our students need to be prepared for that workforce. So one thing that we started with was the idea that artificial intelligence is here to stay. And if we want our students to be workforce ready when they graduate, we must teach the ethical use of artificial intelligence across the curriculum. What does ethical mean? That's part of the big question. And we figure that out together as not only a learning community, but I think honestly as a human race, because our understandings of this will also adapt over time. But we know that if we want our students to be job ready, they will need to understand perhaps not ChatGPT, but the overall idea of how to use artificial intelligence. Now, I mentioned one member of our research team is Dr. Brenda McDermott, who's the manager of our student accessibility services. It was from Dr. McDermott that I learned that there was a precursor to ChatGPT going back to the 1980s. This article by Swiffen et al. In 1987 talked about a technology called predictive text tools. The article actually exists. I went and I found it. You can find it too. But it was about a technology that would allow someone using a word processor to complete their sentence or their words. We all know it now. We use it on our cell phones. This was a technology that was originally developed for persons with disabilities, but is now used by all of us, both to complete our sentences and to generate funny memes when it screws up. But the idea of the ways that these tools can be used for persons with disabilities is something worthy of consideration. And I just wanted to highlight this article from Nature that came out on April 8th, 2024, so just a couple of days ago, by Amanda Haidt. And she says, without these tools, I'd be lost, how generative AI aids in accessibility. And she offers a counter-argument to the rush to place barriers around the use of AI and the way that it could disproportionately affect those who stand to benefit most. She talks in this article about persons with learning disabilities, persons who are neurodivergent, who have ADHD, autism, and other learning difficulties. And we talked about this a little bit in one of the workshops, that some of our students don't know necessarily that they have these difficulties, and they may have difficulty getting diagnoses. What if artificial intelligence can be used as what we would call an equity accelerator to assist those with learning difficulties such that maybe they don't need a diagnosis in order to get assistive technologies that can help them and help others? So thinking about the ways that these technologies can be helpful to our students is another way of framing our understandings of how we want to use them. So let's go back to talking a little bit about academic misconduct and the ways that we can address this in our policies. In some of the policy research that we've done, in some of the chapters in the handbook, there's sort of three framings around academic misconduct that we might want to think about. One would be a traditional, what you say, historical traditional approach, which is largely punitive with roots in administrative law. It's a crime and punishment approach or a search and destroy approach. The idea behind this is that the sanctions or the punishments should be fair and fit the offense. There's a progressive discipline model. So the more students cheat or offend, the harsher the punishment. The ultimate kind of punishment would be exclusion or expulsion from the university. This is often done with multiple offenses. These kinds of programs, if you will, are relatively easy to track if you want to do that, say for an institutional report. How many cases do we have? What was the sanctions? What were the outcomes? How many students cheated? And so on and so forth. But I would say over the past 15 to 20 years, there has been another movement that's come forward, and it's around an educational approach that is more rehabilitative for students, offering students an opportunity to learn. Thinking back to that bell curve of normal with about 80% of people making a bad decision or a poor decision if you put them in the wrong place at the wrong time. That wrong place could be, I procrastinated too long. I don't have the time management skills to do this very well. So we can provide students with opportunities to learn things like paraphrasing, citing, referencing, time management, and so on. This approach seeks to reduce recidivism and repeat offenses, and it can be easy to track in some regards, such as the number of workshops attended or self-reported learning, etc. But it is not as quote-unquote clean to track as the punitive approach. I can tell you in Canada, where we are working to, part of our work around decolonization and indigenization is the use of restorative resolutions and practices, which have been promoted in particular by Indigenous peoples. And we do use restorative approaches and restorative justice in our criminal justice system. We used it long before it came into universities and colleges, but more and more universities and colleges are starting to think about restorative approaches when there's a misconduct. So an approach that seeks to repair harm. Who's harmed when there's academic cheating? Sometimes students think it's a victimless crime, but the teacher who may feel dismayed, disappointed, frustrated, angry, there's harm there. The classmates who may feel that their time was wasted or that they don't want to see their classmates cheating. This restorative approach focuses on community building and long-term relationships. A key difference between this and a punitive approach is not, at the end, we don't want to exclude students from our community. We want to keep them in. And the result of it is, what will it take for you to stay in our community and be a person we can trust, and that you can also find us trustworthy? What does that look like? This does not work in all cases, because the first thing that has to happen is that the individual who's been found responsible, and I can say that we have decriminalized our language around academic misconduct largely in Canada. We don't find students guilty, we hold them responsible for their behavior. And if a student accepts responsibility when there has been a misconduct, then we can start with the possibility of a restorative resolution. This takes training and is fairly intensive. But in situations where it has worked very well, there are very low rates of recidivism, and students will think more deeply about their actions and the impact of their actions on other people. In my opinion, the best kind of academic policy has all three of these because there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to academic misconduct and how to address it. But I think what we want to do is get away from entirely punitive approaches, because those punitive approaches, remember, they go back to the Industrial Revolution, and we can do better for our students. And if you ask me, those punitive approaches, at least from my perspective as a Canadian, continue to perpetuate colonial norms in which power is exercised from one group against another. We can do better, and we should do better. And if we want to decolonize our universities through teaching, learning, we must also think about ways to decolonize our policies and our approaches to student conduct. So that will take me to one other point here, which is around thinking about human rights as a basis for academic integrity. The UN Declaration of Human Rights mentions the word dignity no less than 6 times. But how often would students who've been called up for a misconduct case feel that their dignity has been maintained? We don't actually have any data on this, but we have anecdotes. Students who feel ashamed and that may have mental anxiety, breakdown, or depression after this, that they feel that they are less than human when they have been called in for a meeting about plagiarism or academic cheating. So I'll draw your attention to Article 11 of the UN Declaration for Human Rights that says everyone charged with a penal offense has the right to be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to the law in a public trial at which he's had all the guarantees necessary for his defense. We don't have public trials for academic misconduct. We don't name and shame people. But in so many cases, I talk to professors who have already decided that their student has cheated and their student needs to be punished. But the student themselves hasn't had a chance to respond to the allegations. So I think we should prioritize human rights, prioritize an assumption of innocence, even when we may have seen those exam crib sheets, but certainly maintain dignity of our students as an essential part of that process. As my colleague, Kath Ellis, says in Australia, an academic integrity violation shouldn't be an academic catastrophe. We want to graduate students who are ready to keep going in the workforce. And if we show them how to correct their mistakes in school, they will know how to correct their mistakes once they graduate. So getting close to the end of my talk, I would like to ask you to join me in a call to action about getting our priorities straight with our students for academic integrity and prioritize compassion over course content. In the end, the students remember how the teachers treated them more than the course content. And for us to prioritize dignity and decency over deadlines, for example, and to prioritize future-focused pedagogy in which every new technology is not an automatic assumption of a criminalized way of approaching learning, experimentation, curiosity, and look towards the future. So I would call on you to join me in a pact with students to prioritize equity and integrity as pedagogical imperatives with our students, and to advocate for the ethical use of technology as an equity accelerator, particularly for students with disabilities, whether those are diagnosed or undiagnosed, or diagnosed and undisclosed. And that we would commit to leaving this education better than we found it, including the decolonization of policies and practices that continue to perpetuate harm. And above all else, recognize that artificial intelligence is not taking away our jobs. The robots are not coming for us. That overall, teachers still continue to need us to be great teachers.
So now we can breathe. I looked around the room while she was doing the presentation, and we were all so very engaged. Could you please just give her another? So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Dr. Griffin did the courtesies already. I just want to refer to 3 ideas that Dr. Eaton presented. I'm very, very grateful for this lecture. We are going to join the rest of the world. We're going to do the research. We're going to do all we can for our students because we have them at heart, correct? Yes. Right. And so she spoke about the academic integrity color wheel, beautiful beyond understanding, but packing so much information. She spoke about us being in the post-plagiarism era, something that we have to consider, and that has particular implications for us in the Caribbean who have focused so consistently on plagiarism for a while. So we are now in the post-plagiarism era. What do we do? And she also spoke about ChatGPT being like Kleenex. That is something that we'll take away from today. Do you have the questions? We have the expert in the room. This is our question and answer session. The expert is in the room. No question? Oh, you're thinking, okay, all right.
It's a lot to take in.
It is a lot to take in, and it's kind of different to what we're used to. So, yes, Dr. Griffin.
So, it's the first time I'm hearing of academic integrity in relation to decolonization. And I do a lot of decolonization work. So it's the first time, as I'm always learning from Ruth, because, I'm an archivist, let's start there. And so I dwell in the past, if you understand. And so how can you, spell that out a bit for me? What does decolonization look like within this academic integrity, in the creation of knowledge, really? Because even with decolonization, we're now thinking about other ways of knowledge creation and recognizing that other items are forms of record keeping, form of record creation, form of, communicating one's own content, one's own information. So how does that look like within this paradigm? Thank you.
Thank you for the question around unpacking decolonization and academic integrity. So I can say now I'm the one who's intimidated talking to an actual person who specializes in decolonization. So I will preface it by saying that my understandings are framed within my Canadian context. And talked a little bit about the book that we had on academic integrity in Canada and started contemplating this idea of what does academic integrity look like through an Indigenous lens for us. And a colleague at the University of Calgary did a fantastic project in 2020 called Indigenous Academic Integrity, and actually created or shared with us, so I can name her, Kita Gladue, and she's from the Sucker Creek Cree Nation and the Métis Nation that finds its roots in the Red River Valley of Manitoba in Canada. So I just wanted to acknowledge her origin and how she came to the work. And she has a webinar around this, has a PDF, and talked about academic integrity through storytelling through her lens, and came up with a parallel set of not values but principles, being around relationality, respect, and reciprocity, and walked us and our community through that. And then later, we had some contributors to our book on academic integrity in Canada talk more. So with chapters from Dr. Gabrielle Lindstrom, Dr. Yvonne Patras-Pratt, and Ms. Kita Gladue, expanding on these notions of the ways in which our education system has perpetuated so much harm in the past, and to undo that harm is also through the decolonization and indigenization efforts that we have. And in Canada, we have what we call the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, the 94 calls to action, many of which are framed around education. And so thinking about the ways that these punishments continue to perpetuate colonial norms. And in some of the work, the teachings that I've learned from Kita Gladue, she talks about storytelling, oral storytelling and other forms of storytelling as being a valid way of communicating knowledge. And thinking for me, as someone who, writing is something I've always been good at, and it's something I've always valued with first 2 degrees in literature. And I've heard people say that you need to be able to write to be able to think, and I'm not actually sure that's true anymore. And in part, going back to our own Western notions, I was introduced by Phil Dawson to the idea of cognitive offloading. And he goes back to Socrates and a dialogue with Socrates in which Socrates talked about and questioned writing as being suspicious and privileged oral storytelling, and saying that writing should only be used to remember things. But somehow, with this rise of the printing press, which seemed to peril the rise of colonialism, writing became the sole way that we value how knowledge is transmitted. And so now we're thinking about the ways to de-emphasize writing writing. And I think it can be done in this post-plagiarism world, because as long as we keep assigning students essays that can be done now by robots, like, we really need to think about the ways that we can share knowledge in different ways. I actually think that artificial intelligence creates and opens new opportunities to talk more deeply about decolonization and knowledge, and really challenge this idea that you have to be able to write in order to think. There was a time I thought that, and now I know better. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's take Dr. Milson White and then Dr. Carr.
Thank you. I noticed that with regard to your book on plagiarism, you presented a Western trajectory going from the Greeks through the Euros to the Americans. To what extent do you engage with other traditions where use of materials from elders would not be ridiculed, but would be seen as an honor, and that it would be good for audiences to be able to recognize when an elder's work is cited without naming the elder? To what extent do you engage with such traditions?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I wanted to recognize that this is the tradition that I come from, and that tradition always brings its biases and limitations. So this is one of the limitations of my scholarship, and I want to just ensure that I recognize that. And so thinking about the honoring of the elders, I will say that most of what I have learned in that respect comes from Indigenous colleagues in Western Canada and their traditions, and that they are learning, they are teaching us and challenging our notions around that. And so for me, recognizing that I still have work to do to understand cultures beyond those that are in North America, whether they're settler colonial histories, European histories, or Indigenous North American histories, I'm still learning. Does that help? Oh, is that the question? Is that the method?
That's a follow-up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the follow-up. I can say when we started the Indigenous Academic Integrity Project, it was met with some suspicion, because I knew that this was a gap in academic integrity, that the field is dominated by those largely of European heritage, largely those of Anglophone heritage, and that this was a real disadvantage in our field, and wanted to understand what it would look like through a different lens. So I started with that Indigenous lens and started asking questions, what would it look like? And people, my Indigenous colleagues on our campus said, what do you mean? Are you trying to say Indigenous people cheat more? I'm like, no, I'm trying to understand the knowledge traditions with which I lack this knowledge, and I want to understand how it can be unpacked. And so I started with this curiosity and asked them to sort of unpack that. And we were able to get funding to do this Indigenous Academic Integrity Project. In terms of a method, I think I started by acknowledging my limitations and asking people questions and what does it mean to them. But I'm not cognizant that I have a method, to be honest. But maybe it's something we can grow as a community.
So my other follow-up had to do with applications like ChatGPT, also with its biases, so much predicted on, again, a Western base. So most of the rest of the world is not accounted for in what ChatGPT can produce. But I noticed that you mentioned education should be engaging with applications like ChatGPT. You also mentioned very early that there is this separation between those academics who think we should be thinking of plagiarism in terms of considering morals, values, etc., versus thinking about skills building. Those you speak about regarding skills building are from my tradition. I do rhetoric and composition. And we're like you, we're grappling with what to do with all of these developments. We don't think of ChatGPT as Kleenex, but on one hand, we're seeing it just like when streaming music came about, and we see where the world is at today with that. But what for you are some of the practical ways that you would suggest that educators engage with applications like ChatGPT in classrooms?
I'm not sure that there's a one-size-fits-all, but I would like to share an example from our School of Business, and it's Professor Mohammed Kihani in our School of Business, and he started a class. He's a professor of entrepreneurship, a class around prompt engineering. I'm not even sure we would call it that this school year, but or this coming school year. But he works with students in his classroom and tells them they can use ChatGPT for certain tasks and has them dissect it, analyze it, figure out what is it good at doing, what is it not good at doing, what could be the applications of this in a business setting, and having the students engage in it using their critical thinking skills. So that was one application from business. And for things like humanities, I think it would probably depend on the discipline. For example, thinking about something like English literature, an assignment that would have been assigned is write an essay about the plot of Hamlet. Well, in my generation, we would have bought a little booklet called the Cole's Notes or the Cliff's Notes, right, and use that. But now students will just turn to ChatGPT. But instead, maybe thinking about what are local things that students could write about in relation to this work or engage in conversations, those kinds of things. We certainly don't have all the answers, but also the idea of transparency as being fundamental to this work, having students being able to show their learning process rather than just the learning product. What was their thinking through it? How did they use certain apps? So I have one colleague that says, you can use it, but I want you to document and do the screenshots and show me what you did, how you did it, how you thought through it, how you rejected ideas presented by ChatGPT, what you adopted, and why. So that there can be some use of it if it's used as kind of a sounding board in a way. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I will actually give an example. So I was doing a bit of writing around decolonizing academic integrity. So I asked ChatGPT about this. And it came up with some of the authors that we had in Canada, but also came up with an author that I had never read before, Linda Tawani-Smith. And I thought, who is this? And I need to read her. And so I found her book online, and I read it as part of my own scholarship. But I had been previously unfamiliar with her work, I'm ashamed to say now. But it was because of ChatGPT that I was led to Amazon to buy the book. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that I have a question because I'm Paulette Carr, I'm campus librarian, and my point was actually related to Dr. Milton White's point about the different traditions. And I was coming from, but in a sense it's more nuanced than an Eastern tradition or a Western tradition as we're accustomed to here. Because when I was away doing my doctoral work, in information science, where I studied, there were many Asian students. And for the first few weeks, there was this almost like conundrum of them not understanding this whole plagiarism stuff, because they came from that tradition of elders, and therefore they could be just quoting, and they felt it was the thing to do. It was the thing to do, and so there were always there was always challenges with the professors because of how they wrote. And I was coming from that tradition of citing, and so sometimes they would say, "Go to Paulette." So I became friends with a lot of the Asian colleagues, and I got to understand. And then I had a professor who, because my research was about the information literacy and using, at the time, I was just looking at online tutorials and how librarians talk about critical thinking, and yet in a real sense, we were not doing critical thinking. We were really just telling students, this is the way, and this is the way, and this is the way to do it. So we were not opening their minds to being creative. I like that first lecture about where are the creatives. So the conundrum for me was really about what we call the different traditions. Because I remember having Dr. McLaren having students in the library, and this was before I did my doctoral work. And I remember she had graduate students coming into the library for what we were calling, it wasn't information, yes, it was information literacy at the time, but it was really about research competencies for our students. But when I asked students, these are graduate students who had left UWI and coming back, and I said, we were expecting you to come up with new ways of thinking and new ideas and to become the professors of the future. But the students looked at me like, no, but you all want us to write what you say in lectures. So for me, in a real sense, it's almost like the Asian students who would be citing without any kind of, because they didn't see it as being wrong, but in a different kind of way, we were not empowering our own students to think and to write out of their guts, but to be citing us, consistently citing us. So I'm still wrestling with it, and I had my professor who said to me that one of the things that librarians were doing is that we had a culture of punitive behavior. So we were, saying to students, you're wrong. And he didn't even, initially he didn't want me to do anything on information literacy. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So I would go on. But I'm trying to understand what Dr. Milton White asked, whether it's going to come down to traditions or there is something, the future of plagiarism. I don't know. And it's not a question, it's just for us to be thinking about. How do we empower our students? Yes.
I'm grabbing the mic. All right, so... Oh, yes.
Sure. I don't have an answer to your question, but I think it's an important question. And I do think it's somehow connected to decolonization, thinking as well about this, the printing press almost as being a tool of colonization, right? And before the printing press in Europe, one scholar, might say to another, oh, to be or not to be, as Shakespeare said. Well, if I was in university, well, I wouldn't have been in university because I'm a woman, but that's okay. But before, say, the printing press, a scholar would never have said to another scholar, as Shakespeare said. That would have been an insult, because we all would have known who Shakespeare was. We wouldn't say the person's name, because it would have been insulting the person to say that. It would be like, oh, obviously. But somehow, with the rise of the printing press came the rise in citing and referencing. That became, I think, an almost pathological compulsion to replace the idea of simply giving credit where it's due. This is why I think the ethos of attribution actually matters more. And I was saying in the workshop yesterday, sometimes when people find out I'm a plagiarism scholar, they're shocked when I say, I couldn't give a flying leap about the technical minutiae of citing and referencing. I don't care if it's sentence case or title case capitalization. I don't care if it's a period or a comma, because the style guides are produced by organizations that generate massive amounts of revenue from the sale of those, and it actually has nothing to do with paying respect where it's due. So I think we actually need different ways of giving credit where it's due. Maybe it's not even called citing and referencing. I don't think it's going anywhere in my lifetime, but I hope that we can do things or change things such that what really matters is students paying attention to who they learn from, how they learned, and what the traditions might be, whether it's Western Asian or otherwise, because I think that matters a whole lot more than sentence case or title case capitalization. Yeah.
All right. So, Professor Daniel Kaur sent his question via YouTube. How do you see us giving suitable attribution to ideas that may have come from interactions with AI as they become more deeply incorporated into our ways of doing work? Is it even necessary?
For the moment, I think it's probably necessary because we don't have another way around it. Over time, it may not become necessary, but we're not quite there yet. And I'm not sure, again, there's a one-size-fits-all approach, and it might be around the transparency of it, or these are the apps that I used, because the apps I use this school year may not be the same apps I'm using next school year. But for students to be able to show their work, right, as the mathematicians or the scientists might say, we don't, I think in humanities, do that a whole lot, maybe through drafts, but also the idea of, I think there's an opportunity here to incorporate more orality with our students and conversation and dialogue and asking them to converse with us about what they know. That may not be possible in, say, the large lectures, the first-year psychology class. I don't know how big yours are. I think ours are about 400 or 500 students. But if there's a way even that teaching assistants can help with that as well, but to incorporate or perhaps reincorporate elements of orality and diminish our pathological dependence on writing as a sole form or a preferred form of assessment.
Thank you very much. We'll take one final question from Dr. Griffin.
Right, so this is from Dr. Therese Ferguson, our Deputy Dean for Graduate Students, Graduate Matters. The A impact on the screen, advocate for ethical use of technology as an equity accelerator. How can we make institutions more receptive given the punitive approach that pervades? Are there any suggestions?
One of the things I've learned from Dr. Brenda McDermott on this project is the way that there is an overemphasis on medicalized approaches to student disability, including learning disability. Students cannot get an accommodation unless they come with medical documentation. And so I've been learning from the work of Jay Dolmage and others who advocate for a socialized model towards disability where a self-disclosure may be sufficient rather than medical certification. This, I think, could also help to preserve human dignity. There is this fear of the disability con, that somebody will fake a disability in order to gain an advantage. And that may be true in some cases, but certainly not all cases. In fact, we have students on our campus who have learning disabilities and won't disclose them because they don't want to be discriminated against. And so if there's ways to reduce the discrimination for students with diagnosed or undiagnosed learning disabilities, that would be one way, I think, to potentially approach it.
And I think I will have the privilege of making the final question, pseudo comment sort of a thing. So speaking from a management hat, you've spoken primarily in terms of academic integrity, centering it primarily as in a sense, a discipline, a research product. But as a, deputy principal, one of the things we know recognize is the weaponization of academic integrity, which can reputationally affect a university as well as the individuals within the university. So I didn't see in a lot of your framework the whole legal ramification of academic integrity. So would you want to just comment? We see what happened to Harvard and all of those nice places.
Yeah, I think that your point about reputation and potential hesitation about reputational harm or damage is real. And I can say in Canada, I think this dialogue has been happening now intensely for about a decade. And at the beginning, certainly there was more reluctance to talk about it, the idea of not airing our dirty laundry. And now I think it's common that every publicly funded university and college in Canada would have, for example, an annual misconduct report that comes out and shows the incidences of misconduct. Right now we only have it for students. We don't yet have it for professors or researchers. But the idea of transparency. But it's scary and probably, frankly ill-advised if only one university does it. But if many universities do it, then there's strength in the numbers. To the point now, we're at the point where if a university doesn't have that report, we say, what are you trying to hide? But no, I think it's unrealistic to expect that any university would be the first one, but for a number of universities to agree that they would take this approach as part of a leadership, ethical practice, and a commitment to transparency would be one way. Yeah. Does that help? Okay.
Just want to say thank you to Dr. Eaton, inviting our dean to come and make a presentation.
Well, we didn't want to let you go without something to remember us by, so here you go.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Ruth Baker-Gardner. Thank you again, Dr. Eaton. And we have come to the end of a very interesting and intriguing lecture. And I know we want to thank Dr. Eaton again for her thoughts and for the fascinating history and advice going forward. There is a reception prepared, so please don't run off. And I want to thank our dean, thank DLIS, Ms. Sophia Hales-Johnson, and the team in the faculty office, MITS, for streaming live, our security, our facilities management, colleagues, and our catering for bringing this evening to the wonderful package that it is. Thank you very much for participating, and we hope to see each of you and more at the 10th Distinguished Lecture next academic year. Thank you.